I'd like to ask everybody to give Dr. James Johnson a warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you, to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, our nation, every region in our country, and every state represented in this room is in the midst of an unprecedented demographic transformation. The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, you're going to have to buckle your seatbelt to deal with them. And if you ignore them at your own peril. There are lots of things we can debate in society today, politically and the like. I want to suggest to you that basic demography is not one of them. I assure you, if you're 5 years old today, 5 years from now, you're going to be 10 years old. Your birthday comes the same time every year. You just add one to what it was last year, and voila, you got it. In fact, I'm going to be on my way back to the University of North Carolina because I got to have my annual review. And every year when I walk in for my annual review, I come out with a big raise. And because I walk in and tell my dean, you know what? When we met last year, I was 62 years old. You know what? I'm 63 now. And next year when we meet, I'll be 64. It's called forecasting. I'm the best in the business. The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, we call them disruptive demographic changes because they're going to dramatically transform all of our social, economic, and political institutions. They're going to transform the workforce. They're going to transform workplaces. They're going to transform consumer markets. They're going to transform the communities that you represent on a daily basis. I want to talk about what those big trends are. We call them disruptive trends. I want to talk about the trends. I want to talk about what the challenges and opportunities are for us and what all of this means for the Y and other youth and family serving organizations. There are 6 trends. I'll list them and then we'll talk about each one of them. The first one is the South rises again. The second one is the browning of America. The third one is marrying out is in. The fourth one is the silver tsunami is about to hit. The fifth one, the end of men. I didn't make it up. It's actually the title of a book by an author who's a writer for the Atlantic magazine named Hannah Rosen, The End of Men. The only disagreement I had with her, she had a period at the end of the sentence. Being a man, I refused to put a period at the end of the sentence. So we're going to see if it has any juice in just a moment. And the last one is Cooling Water from Grandma's Well. Anybody know what that is? It's actually a song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but I'm going to tell you what it's all about. Cooling Water from Grandma's Well and Grandpa's Too. Let's talk about what each one of these means and the work that you do on a daily basis. People are highly mobile in our society today, both domestically and internationally. The South rises again is about the southern United States as defined by the Census Bureau, those states in red. If you know your history dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, you know that this was an economically backwards region. It had all kinds of racial and ethnic problems. And so for much of the 20th century, it was the place to leave as opposed to the place to be. I actually grew up in the South of North Carolina, and I went to high school in 1968, which means I was in the first wave of school integration in the South. And I remember quite vividly, as if it were yesterday, my first freshman year in high school. I was an athlete, sort of, let's just leave it at that. And I was on the football team, and I remember our first football game of my freshman year was an away game, and when we arrived at the stadium to play the opposing team, the KKK was marching outside the stadium, daring us to beat the opposing team. We beat them so bad they couldn't spell KKK by the end of the night, but that was the way the South was. It was a place to leave as opposed to the place to be, and I couldn't wait to get out of the South when I finished college. If you look at the data very carefully, what you will see, you'll see the impact. For the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the South only captured about 30% of net national population growth in our country. And then something profound occurred. In every decade since 1970, the South has captured about half of net national population growth in this country. We've gone from a region where we speak 2 languages, English and bad English, to one today we speak more than 300 different languages. We've become demographically the cat's meow in terms of destination selection for people, including the first decade of the new millennium. We added 27 million people to our population, 14.3 million of them concentrated in the South, growing at about 53% of that growth. The second most rapidly growing region was the west region of the country, capturing about 32%. It's very, very small shares, under 10% in the Northeast and the Midwest as well. What's going on is this profound redistribution of population from the Northeast and the Midwest to the West and the South, and tag we're in that region. What's going on? It's all about migration. It's all about immigration. Look at the data. The South, everybody moving to the South in larger numbers than we're leaving. You talk about all migrants. You talk about African Americans. You talk about Hispanic, Latino, Latinx people. You talk about the elderly, the foreign-born. Everybody moving south in larger numbers than we're leaving. You can't say that about the West region. The West was losing during this period, both Hispanics and the elderly. If you go to the Midwest, the only group that were moving there in larger numbers than we're leaving during this 2000-2008 period were the elderly. This is a news flash, folks. After this latest cold snap, they're the heck out of there too. So just buckle your seatbelt in the South. They're coming. The Northeast is kind of like when the last person leaves, please turn off the lights if there's still any on there. You can see this movement in the South, in a place like North Carolina in particular. All you got to do is pay attention to license tags. Not when you're driving, but when you're in the parking lot, you see all these snowbirds headed south, exerting impacting the South and profoundly transforming the complexion of our region demographically. But I lied to you. I said it was the South. It's really not the South. This movement is about 4 states in the South, at least during the first decade of New Millennium. This movement is about Texas. It's about Florida. It's about Georgia and North Carolina. Those 4 states captured about 71% of that net national change. The other southern states combined captured about 29% of that growth. So we talk about migration magnets, if you will. So those of you who are in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, buckle your seatbelt. You've already experienced some of this, but if you think you have experienced it already, you haven't seen anything yet, this trend will continue down the road. I stopped purposely at 2008 because we've had something called the Great Recession in our country, and the question becomes, what impact did the Great Recession have on these the first decade of New Millennium trends that we've observed? The answer is a slowdown in the magnitude of movement, not a change in the directionality of movement. Upper left-hand quadrant, before the Great Recession, 2004 to 2007, the South gained about 655,000 people. After the Great Recession, it dropped to 397,000 people. If you look at Florida, Florida actually flipped during the Great Recession. Why would Florida, always been a migration magnet, why would Florida flip during the Great Recession? Well, lots of those people who moved to Florida with nice retirement portfolios, what happened to their retirement? That went further south. I'm going to show you momentarily. They're back in the workforce. They're called the newly unretireds. And then there are people who moved to Florida who age to a level where they need caregiving support. And what did their caregivers say? We're not coming there. You have to come to where we are. What I want you to understand is that I'm talking about long-range demographic trends, but they can be interrupted by changes in the business cycle. Obviously, Florida and the South, the numbers are back to where we observed them, as you will see momentarily, in terms of the first decade of the New Millennium, but you can have those disruptions that upset regional trends. And international migration, we've been pretty draconian on international migrants since 9/11, and we're coming increasingly more draconian on them today. I want to suggest to you that that's not a good thing for us, and I'll show you why in just a moment. So what's happened since 2010, between 2010 and 2016, we've added another 14 million people to our population in this country, 7.8 million of them concentrated in the South, 4.7 million of them concentrated out west. The trend, the trajectory that we observed during the first decade continues in the second decade of the New Millennium. Very, very slow growth in the Northeast, very, very small shares of that growth in the Northeast and the Midwest in terms of change. The only difference in a second decade of New Millennium is no longer just Texas, Florida, and Georgia, and North Carolina. I have to add Virginia to the mix because the beltway in and around D.C. is growing really, really rapidly. Those are the migration magnet states accounting for much of this growth. It doesn't mean in these other southern states that you don't see rapid population change. You do, but it's relative to what's going on in those major migration states. At the same time that we've had this incredible redistribution of population focused on the West and especially the South, the composition in 2 ways, the racial and ethnic composition of our population and the age composition of our population has been changing dramatically as well. We say that there are 2 colorful processes that reflect and manifest those changes. One we call the browning of America, and the other we call the graying of America. Let me develop both of them for you quickly. The browning of America is about immigration-driven population change in our country. To get you to appreciate what I mean by the browning of America, I need to do a quick immigration history for you to contextualize what I'm talking about. These are cartograms where we've exaggerated the size and shapes of foreign countries proportional to the number of legal immigrants we've invited to America. There are three graphics here, 1921 to 1960, 1961 to 86, and 1987 to 98. Focus, if you will, on the top panel of that graphic, and remember that the size of the foreign country is proportional to the number of legal immigrants entering our country, the United States. If you look at that top panel, most of the legal immigrants entering our country between 1921 and 1960 originated where? Most of them originated in Europe. Very few originated where? In Asia, and a smaller share in Latin America compared to Europe, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that was an intentional immigration pattern because until the mid-1960s, we had an immigration law in this country that said if we were going to allow the foreign-born to enter our country, it was important that they not upset the existing racial and ethnic balance of our country as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. So we had an express preference for people who were phenotypically similar to Anglo-Saxons. People could come to America, anglicize their names and the like, and this thing called a melting pot was supposed to work. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, to the mid-1960s, we operated on a quota system that was geographically discriminatory against people from certain regions of the world. If you go back into our immigration history to the 1880s, you will note that we had something called the Chinese exclusion law. They shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be quote unquote difficult to assimilate into mainstream society. Fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, we defined what became known as the Asiatic barrier region that included Japan. Shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be quote unquote difficult to assimilate. And we justified those laws based on a series of racist theories about cultural inferiority and the like. So we control the composition of our population based on our immigration law. Fast forward to the second panel in this graphic, you begin to see something interesting occur. What you will notice in that mid panel, immigration from Europe shrinks relative to the first period. What begins to grow? You see an accelerated growth in Asia and an increasing growth in Latin America in terms of the origins of immigrants. How did that come about? It came about coincidence with the civil rights movement and domestic life in the 1960s. We liberalized our immigration law in 1965 via something called the Hart-Celler Act of that year. Put a pin in it because it's one of the most profound pieces of legislation in our history. What did it do? It eliminated those discriminatory provisions based on geographic origin, opening up the doors of our country to people who heretofore had not been allowed to come. This 1965 period is so important in our history that we use it as a dividing line to distinguish two groups of immigrants in America. Anybody arriving prior to 1965, we refer to them as the old immigrants, and we refer to them further as the invisible minorities. Why invisible? Phenotypically similar to the Anglo-Saxon model, you go through the assimilation process, you change your name, becomes difficult to distinguish where you're from. Anybody arriving since 1965, we call the new immigrants, and we refer to them further as the visible minorities. Why visible? Phenotypically different from the Anglo-Saxon model, from radically different regions of the world. Yes, they can go through the assimilation process, but you will always know that they're different because their phenotype is different from the Anglo-Saxon model. Fast forward to the third panel, what you will note is that immigration from Europe almost disappears. It looks a lot like immigration from Asia in the first period, ladies and gentlemen, since 1965 and the Hart-Celler Act, when we liberalized our immigration law. The majority of immigrants arriving in America have arrived from Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. These are people of color, ladies and gentlemen, that are driving the kinds of shifts in the complexion of our society as we know it. Takeaway number one in the browning of America, fundamental shift in geographic origin. Takeaway number two, fundamental shift in phenotype. Takeaway number three, the numbers change dramatically across those time periods. Left-hand side of this graphic. In 1920 to 1961, we only allowed about 206,000 legal immigrants to enter our country on an annual basis. During the early 60s to the late 90s, between 561,000 and 800,000. Early 2004 is in the 879,000 range. Since 2005, about 1 million to 1.1 million legal permanent residents entering our country, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. Put a pin in it, because understand that if current people have their way in this country, we're going to cut that in half to about 500,000 people per year. I want to suggest to you that that's not a good thing. I'll tell you why in just a moment. At the same time, in the early 1960s, we said we were a nation of immigrants for the first time, and thus we should be open to people who are being persecuted in their homelands for economic, political, or religious reasons. So refugees, parolees, and asylees. Those numbers fluctuate on the right-hand side of this graphic, depending on our predilection to allow them to enter our country, but those that we have allowed have contributed to the growing diversity of our population. When you look at immigration law in this country, that's what it is. That's pretty much it. Is it controversial? Yes, it's controversial and becoming increasingly more controversial, but that's not the biggest issue that is controversial in terms of immigration. It's when you move from talking about people who come through legal channels to people who come through illegal channels, who are unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. Now, illegal immigration wasn't much of a problem in America prior to 1965 for two reasons: the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. You ever met anybody try to swim either one of those bodies? It just wasn't much of a problem. But since 1965, a fundamental shift in geographic origin, a southern border that has been, for the most part, fluid. This thing called illegal immigration has assumed greater importance, or unauthorized immigration. How important? 300,000 to 400,000 people annually over the last couple of decades. The current controversy about illegal immigration in this country is not new. It has been around for quite some time. I was on the faculty at UCLA in California through the 80s and 90s, and there was a lot of discussion at that time in California about too many illegal immigrants. We need to do something to stem the tide. At that time, the federal government says, well, maybe if we saturate labor demand, if we fill every job in our economy, there'll be no reason for any other person to enter our country illegally looking for a job. How do we propose to fill every job in our economy? Via something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. We said to any person in America who was here illegally that if you've been here illegally and you can document that you've been here illegally since before 1982, we will grant you amnesty, no questions asked. So, well, how many people accepted the federal government's offer of amnesty? About 3 million people came forward, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. Understand, though, that the numbers of the amnesty legislation were actually bigger than that, because immigration law says that once you accept amnesty, you're entitled to bring family members via the family provision of the law, so you had even more. But what we know is that there were about 2.7 million people here illegally who didn't trust the federal government enough to come forward. They said, I ain't going for the okadoke, you're not going to identify me and deport me. And they didn't go home. So by 1996, we estimated that there were about 5 million unauthorized immigrants in America. And if you followed the debate since 2005, those numbers have ranged wildly between about 7 million and about 15 million. In my business, I'm a business demographer, and I probably average 3 to 5 calls a month from the media asking me about how many illegal immigrants there are in this country. And when it first started happening to me, I was a little nervous about it, so I'd stay up all night figuring, checking my numbers, braze a path to the restroom and the like, get on a plane, coming to give a talk, ask the flight attendant the first time I get there about a napkin so I could do figure, because you want your numbers to be right. And then I discovered the only person getting old and ugly in this process was me. And so now whenever they call me and ask me about how many illegal immigrants in America, I just say a lot. The real number is about 11 million people. Now, when you hear the discussion about illegal immigrants, what group becomes the poster child for talking about illegal immigration in America? Some person of Mexican descent surreptitiously crossing the Rio Grande, right? I want to suggest to you it's a little bit more complicated than that, but in order to get you to understand the complication, I got to confuse you a little bit, but it's not me doing it, it's the way the numbers are gathered. Are you aware that there are a group of immigrants in America called non-immigrants? Non-immigrants are people we invite to America on a temporary basis. There are about 68 different categories of these people. They enter America on visas, temporary visas. Tourists, foreign diplomats, international students, and international baseball players all enter America on temporary visas. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enter America on a 90-day temporary visa and you stay 91 days, what are you? No, you're called a visa overstayer. Ladies and gentlemen, 40 to 45% of the illegal immigrants in America walk through the door with papers from the federal government. When it's time to go home, what do? They stay. Understand the terrorists of 9/11, 6 of them were here with temporary visas that hadn't expired. 3 of them fit the visa overstay category. When it was time to go home, they just blew us off and stayed. Another 6, we don't know how the heck they got here. And the last one came on a student visa, was supposed to go to California to learn to read and speak English, but instead went to flight school in Florida. And we now know after the fact the flight school was a bit dubious of this guy, so they reported him to the Immigration Service, the Federal Aviation Administration, anybody that would listen because of his poor facility of English. The guy could speak English well enough to tell the flight school that he had no interest in learning how to land planes, only to fly them. Why don't you hear much about this population? Well, it's big business for us. Look, the numbers grew from about 11.7 million in 1981, right before 9/11, 32.8 million people entered the country on temporary visas. Tourists spend $3,000 to $5,000 per visit. International students contribute $12.8 billion to our economy annually. Why? They have to pay 10 to 15% higher than out-of-state tuition, and they're not allowed to work, so they have to pay their full freight of cost of living while they're here. And please don't tell me that an international baseball player is a low-wage worker. It's big business for us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you get nothing out of what I'm saying today, understand that we're not having an honest discussion about illegal immigration in America. We have allowed one particular group, many of whom have low income, from poor backgrounds, Mexican immigrants who want to come to America, work hard, take care of their families, send money back home that redounds to the benefit of our economy through export market opportunities. We've allowed them to be persecuted. I said, I didn't mix my words, that it's about 40 to 45% of people walking through the door. So building a wall around the country and people who want to do that won't solve our illegal immigration problem in this America. And my question, my further point here is, if you are worried about homeland security, it's probably not the poor Mexican immigrant that you need to be worried about. It's probably these folks. You know why? They come from all over the world. Please don't be offended by what I'm about to say. They look a lot like y'all. In fact, I don't know who's illegal in here. I'm going to find out before I leave. And they could be sitting beside you in some of the most sensitive areas of our economy and you not know it. We are not having an honest conversation about illegal immigration, and it's something that we need to be mindful of and address in a critical kind of way moving forward and not stereotype. My more general message to you, immigration is playing a greater role. You see we have about 43 million people who are foreign born in the country today. We kept immigration low into the mid-1960s. You see that huge takeoff there. Who are these folks? Well, about 46% of them are indeed Hispanic, Latino. The second largest group is about 26% are Asian. You will note that immigrants, foreign-born people who are white, non-Hispanic, only accounts for about 18% of that pool. If you were looking at prior to 1965, those numbers would have been reversed because we had the preference for European immigrants. Again, what I'm talking about in terms of browning of America is the source of growth in that population. If you completed your 2010 census, they asked you to self-identify. They asked you, were you Hispanic or you non-Hispanic? And then if you said you were non-Hispanic, they asked you, were you non-Hispanic, white, black, American Indian, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or a person of 2 or more races. What did the census results show? It showed that of that 27 million people we added to our population during the first decade, 15.2 million of them were Hispanic. You will note at the top in yellow, right above the yellow line, about 12.2 of them were non-Hispanic, but the number I want to draw your attention to is the increase in the non-Hispanic white population during the first decade. It grew by 2.3 million people, or 1.2%. The Hispanic population grew by 15.2 million, or 43%. Everybody between that yellow line all the way close down those orange lines, those are people of color. You will note double-digit growth in everybody except American Indians, Alaska Natives, and American Indians. It's 9%. It's close enough to double-digit. When I talk about the browning of America, I'm talking about the source of growth and where it is coming from in our society. If you ask the question, what percentage of that 27 million people were non-white, 92% of it was non-white, and about 55% of it was Hispanic. In the South, it was about 80% and 46%. When I talk about the browning of America, that's what I'm talking about, is the source of growth. Same thing for the 2010-2016 period, that 14 million people, 92% of it non-white, 51% of it Hispanic. You can see the numbers for the migration magnet states here, all transforming the complexion of the societies and the communities that you will be serving moving forward. This is so important to our future, ladies and gentlemen, in our nation, because migration and immigration are age-selective processes. What does that mean? It means far more young people migrate and immigrate than old people. Doesn't mean old people don't move, they move slower and at a lower propensity than young folks. There's one more piece to this story. Don't repeat this anywhere. You could get put out of the Y organization. In fact, I'm denying I say this before I say it. But young people are more likely to have children than old folks. When you put those two things together, age selectivity of population coming in, higher fertility among young people, it has an impact on the age structure in your society. Look at it. You see that the median age of the U.S. population in 2014 was about 38. Half of us older than that, half of us younger than that. What was the median age of a Hispanic, Latino, Latinx person in America? 28 years old. How many of you have heard that Hispanics are a burden on the healthcare system in the immigration debate? What kind of major health problems do you have when your median age is 28? Now, before you answer the question, what's the median age of a white non-Hispanic in America up there? It's 43. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're in your 20s, your health conditions are typically acute. You've done something stupid like stick your finger in the lawnmower and you got to go to the hospital and get it glued back on. But when you move from your 20s to your 40s, your health conditions move from acute to what? Chronic. Which one costs the most? Chronic. Trust me, I know. I lost my wife to cancer at 48 years old. Her treatment in the last 6 months was like $5,000 a week. Just lost a dear friend to a rare form of throat cancer. His treatment, $17,000 a week. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the stuff you hear makes no sense in society. And there's one more piece to this story, and this is for the ladies in the room. Ladies, you can tell the men to close their ears, but I think they need to hear this. There is something, ladies, in demography called completed fertility, okay? I'm not going to give you the big theory today. If you all want that, come to Chapel Hill, give us $100,000 a year. I'll tell you early and often. I'll give you the pop version of it. Completed fertility, ladies, is when you tell your husband, go take out the trash, ain't nothing else happening here. And completed fertility for women occurs between the ages of 40 and 44. There's this precipitous drop in fertility in those ranges. What's the median age of a white non-Hispanic female in America? 42 years old. What's the median age of a Hispanic female in America? 29. We know exactly where births are going to come from in the future. We know exactly where they're going to come from. Now, I know there's probably some of y'all in your 40s in here tomorrow. I'm going to go home and fix this tonight. I would say, go ahead. Leave now. You might go home and squeeze out one, but you're not going to do what a 29-year-old can do. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the key to our future and the key to who you are going to be serving down the road, because what you will notice between the two yellow lines, far last column, all of the women between those two yellow lines are women of color. And you will note a 10 to 20 year gap in the median age. Do you know what that gap is? That's your fertility gap. We know exactly where kids are going to come from. We know exactly what you have to deal with moving forward. And you need to understand that it's a demographic phenomenon that there's not much that we can do about. And it's not unique to the United States. All of these demographics are impacting our society in major ways. We see the impact in 66% of all births in America were to non-Hispanic white families. That dropped to 50% in 2008. For the first time in history, 2011, non-Hispanic white births dropped below 50%. It's unlikely to go the other way because of this shift in age structure and fertility. We're talking about a heck of a color adjustment in our population, what I call the browning of America. In 2005, 67% of our population was non-Hispanic white. 10 years earlier, it was 74%. We now think the non-Hispanic white share is going to drop below 50% at around 47% by 2050. What you're talking about, the services that you're going to be providing, the population is going to be far more diverse moving forward in the future. At the same time that immigration is driving a profound change in the complexion of our society, we are aging as a native-born population, and in particular, we're aging, the non-Hispanic white population is aging, what we call the graying of America. And so it's probably safe to just ask the question and get it out of the way. Well, how do I know if I'm part of the graying of America? There are actually 4 ways. Number 1, if you have difficulty seeing this screen, you're part of the graying of America. Number 2, if you have to go to the restroom twice during this presentation, you're part of the graying of America. And number 3, if you fall asleep during this presentation, you're just an old codger, it's not my fault, you're part of the graying of America. The graying of America is about 3 things. It's about changes in longevity, it's about declining fertility, and it's about a group of us born between 1946 and 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living much longer today than we ever envisioned when we introduced Social Security in our society. In 1935, when Social Security was introduced, the average person turning 65 was going to live another 12.7 years. That same person today turning 65 is going to live another 18.7 years to about 83. And we now think living to 100 on a routine basis is well within reach. There's one school of thought that says a person who will live to 130 has already been born. Why? Well, major healthcare advances that are extending our lives. You all are eating better some of the time. You are more active some of the time. And now we have scientists, we have one in North Carolina that are engaged in what is called regenerative medicine. We have a scientist that have regenerated a bladder. So your bladder wear out, we'll sell you another one. You just tell me what color you want. We're working on every body part around the world, and this thing about extended longevity and the like is something that's really, really big. We think there'll be well over 600,000 centenarians by 2050. I've seen some new numbers, has it now in the range of 750,000 to 1 million people who will be 100 years old or older in our society. So this longevity thing is driving a lot of demography in our communities. And fertility rates are way down. This room is a powerful statement. Ladies, as you all become educated and career-oriented and start working and the like, what happens to the age at marriage? It goes up. What happens to the age at first childbirth if you do it at all? It goes up. As those 2 things go up, it depresses fertility. If you are a couple, you need to have, in a statistical sense, 2.1 kids to replace yourself. If that is the replacement rate, who in America is replacing themselves, children-wise? You have one group, ladies and gentlemen, that's the Hispanic Latino population. Non-Hispanic whites in America have had a total fertility rate between 1.7 and 1.9 for 2 decades. Now, I'm a bit confused by this 1.9 figure because I don't know how you get 0.9 of a kid. I taught a few of them in my day, but it takes 2.1 kids to replace you. Ladies and gentlemen, you build a wall around your country and you try to send everybody home that you don't like, you got a slight problem. It's called the future competitiveness of our nation, and it's called a drain on the kids that you're created to serve moving forward. It's biology, it's not sociology that's driving these changes. And then there's a group of us who were born between 1946 and 1964. Let me see a show of hands. Everybody born between 1946 and 1964. Some of y'all that's refusing to put your hands up lying, but it's all right. Those of us who put our hands up, born between 1946 and 1964, are part of the post-World War II hormonal rush in America. Our fathers went off to World War II and they came back home and got busy. They got busy to the tune of producing 81 million of us. We're known as the boomer generation. And on January 1st of 2011, the first baby boomer born in America turned 65 and became eligible for what? Everything. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year for the next 20 years, we boomers will be turning 65 at the rate of 8,000 per day. That's every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year for the next 20 years. You can look at it here. We were in 2010, we were between the ages of 45 and 64, that 81 million people increasing at a rate of 32%. You will note that the second most rapidly growing population was the 65 plus population. Why? That person turning 65 is going to live another 18.7 years. So you got longevity for one group, and then you got the pig and the python, this huge wave of older people that are aging out of the market. That's the silver tsunami. That's the pig and the python marching out of society. But it creates a problem for us, ladies and gentlemen, because when somebody tells you that Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system, do you understand what that means? It means that you are paying into the system, but somebody else is spending your money. In order for you to get something out of it, a younger group of people have to be doing what? Working and paying into the system. But you got a slight problem. What happened to the 25 to 44-year-old population? It actually declined. Now, one of the things that people have missed is that some of the debilitating diseases that beset us boomers and pre-boomers later in life are now besetting Gen X and Gen Y earlier in life, leading to the early onset of death and disability. And it's mostly lifestyle factors, diabetes, obesity. And how many wars have we fought in the last 20 years, and who gets taken out in war? It's mostly young people. But probably the biggest thing today, that's the opioid crisis in 1999. That's it in 2014. 11,000 people hospitalized daily and well over 100 deaths every day. Who are they? They're prime working age individuals whom we need to be working in the system, paying into the system to sustain the social safety net for an aging population. Connect the dots, ladies and gentlemen. All of this raises challenges for who walks in the door of the Y and what kinds of challenges the kids face. Many of them increasingly will be orphan children to the opioid crisis and the like, or grandparents who all of a sudden didn't know that they had to take care of another generation of kids because of this kind of crisis. 8,000 per day turning 65, that's the size of the population. But I don't want you to think us old fuddy-duddies are obsessing over memory loss, incontinence, and the like. We are actually one mobile bunch of people, and where are we all headed? We're all headed south, so those of you who have wives in the southern United States, buckle your seatbelt, because that huge retirement migration is headed there. And actually, out west, any state that's in red here, the elderly population is growing more rapidly than above the national average, and the yellow states is below the national average. These are the places that are really, really growing, the micropolitan areas, metropolitan areas. They're usually amenity-rich areas, mountains, golf courses, water. You can have all of those amenities if you don't have one other thing. The elderly are not moving there. That is world-class health care within 30 to 45-minute commute, all providing this profound change in communities throughout the country on those destinations. Unfortunately, there are some places in our country, they're mostly rural counties, where young people are leaving behind an older population that's aging in place. The green places and the purple places on this map, they have dependency problems. What does that mean? They have far more older adults than they have young working age people to take care of them, and this is one of the major challenges moving forward. How do we help those people age with dignity and grace in those communities, or how do we attract a younger population back to those areas to make things happen moving forward? This aging thing is no joke, because internally to your organizations, what that means is you have 4 generations in your workplace now, and soon to be 5. Everybody from the pre-boomer born in 1945 or earlier, who's most familiar in the Lord with the rotary dial phone, to the millennial who waltzes in at 10:30 in the morning with 2 buds in the ear whistling. And then there's all of us boomers who arrive at 5:30 in the morning, because that's the way we roll. And the boomer looks at the millennial and says, look at there, that's a bad work ethic. Come rolling up in here at 10:30 in the morning. The millennial takes the 2 buds out long enough to look at the boomer and say, you can't spell work ethic, because I finished walking in the door what you've been navel-gazing at since 5:30 this morning. And Mr. Pre-Boomer's still trying to get the first rotary dial call out for the day. And then there's you with an HR system with a one-size-fits-all, not understanding that everybody walks into the workplace with different values, different views of authority and the like. And it's costing lots of money in our organizations and creating all kinds of problems for us. Those are the number of people across those generations that are still in the workplace. And this thing is probably one of the biggest organizational challenges for us moving forward, whether it be in the public sector, private sector, or nonprofit sector. There'll be a couple of issues: succession planning. Everybody who raised their hand like I did as a boomer, sooner or later you got to go. And so the question becomes, how do you think about replacing those of us who have to leave, fully understanding that the next generation can't look at it like us? It needs to be far more diverse because the marketplace is changing. Your communities that you're serving are changing dramatically in the process. So this whole notion of succession planning, how do you think about recruitment? How do you think about retention? How do you think about growing internally to develop leadership roles in your organizations? And how do you think about knowledge succession? Those of us who've been around the block a time or two, we've gained quite a bit of a knowledge. Well, what's going to happen to that knowledge when we leave? Well, if you haven't forgotten it all, it's going to go with you. The real challenge is how do you facilitate knowledge succession from that older retiring generation to the next generation there. And child care won't be the big issue in most organizations moving forward. I just showed you how fertility rates are down. What will it be? It's going to be elder care. And elder care is radically different from child care. Child care is actually quite predictable. You drop your crumb snatcher off at the daycare in the morning, you go pick them up at 5:30 in the afternoon. But if you have a loved one in particular with Alzheimer's or dementia and you're responsible for care, you're going to have to figure out how to squeeze work in moving forward because it's all encompassing in terms of the responsibility. In HR circles, you all talk a lot about work-life balance. We've thrown that out the door. We talk now about work-life integration because of the all-consuming nature of elder care responsibilities. And don't think it's just us old boomers and pre-boomers who have elder care responsibilities. 10 million millennials in America have elder care responsibilities. And you might say, well, how can a millennial have elder care responsibilities? Allow me to explain it to you quickly. Assuming that I'm 55 years old, I'm not. Assuming that in my 55th year, I go through a midlife crisis, I didn't. Assume in my 55th year, in my midlife crisis, I marry a 30-year-old. Heaven forbid. And assume in my 55th year, my midlife crisis with my 30-year-old, we have a child. How old am I when that kid turns 20? Old enough for your kid to look at you and say, what the heck were you thinking? Because all of a sudden that kid has elder care responsibility. That's how you get there. You don't know in your organizations who has elder care responsibilities, but what I will tell you is it's a $40 billion problem in lost work productivity because people don't talk about it because there's no HR system to accommodate it. Only about 38% of private sector companies have any focus on retirement and retirement decisions and dependent care from a retirement standpoint. It's only beginning. The waves have not even changed in terms of those things. Family life's changing at the same time that we're browning and aging. Marrying out is in. This is, until the mid-1960s, it was even illegal for blacks and whites to marry in America. That has all changed now, but this is not about just blacks, whites marriage. It's about a more profound shift in marriage patterns. The out-marriage rate among newly married couples has doubled between 1980 and 2010 from about 7% to about 15% of all marriages among currently married people. It went from 3% to 8%. That means you marry someone of a different racial or ethnic group than you belong to. Well, who's been doing all this hooking up in strange ways? Well, about 41% of those marriages are between Hispanics and whites. About 15% of them are between Asian and white. And in about 16% of the cases, both marriage partners are non-white, Asian and black, Hispanic and Asian or whatever. Note that black-white marriages is the smallest share at about 11%. There's another group, I don't know who the heck they are, but they're hooking up and having fun. What's the connection here, ladies and gentlemen? The second most rapidly growing population behind the Hispanic Latino population are people who self-identify as two or more races. What does that mean? Be careful how you portray family life in your advertising and marketing and the like of your organizations out there, because we're talking about a profound change, and it has implications for programming. It has implications for whose history do we teach in our school systems and a whole range of other things. But the big thing is, and you can see it increasingly now, we're beginning to market and advertise. You look at corporate sector advertisements and the like, you begin to see these mixed race couples and the like on TV and the like. People, when it first started, people didn't like it, but companies understand that this is America, and in moving forward, it's going to be more and more of these mixed race households. So buckle your seatbelt and get on with it in real kinds of ways that you reflect and appreciate those folks. Living arrangements are also very much more diverse moving forward. My message, Cooling Water from Grandma's Well and Grandpa's Too, is about one of the most rapidly growing household types of the first decade of new millennium, grandparents raising grandchildren. If you look at all households with children, it grew by 3.8% between 2001 and 2010. Households where no grandparents are present with just husband and wife and their children grew by 1.4%. Both grandparents present raising grandchildren, 42%. Grandmother only raising grandchildren, 9.3%. Grandfather only raising grandchildren grew by about 29%. Now, you may be thinking about your grandmother and my grandmother. My grandmother was 97 when she passed away. That means she almost had an AARP card when I was born. What you should understand about these numbers, about a third of these households, these grandparents are between the ages of 30 and 50. What does that mean? Don't look all cross-eyed when one of your staff people, 31 years old, walks up to you and says, I need time off this afternoon to go to school to check on my what? Grandchild. It'll be real. Understand that. I have a school for vulnerable children in North Carolina. We have 200 Black and Latino kids, 95% free and reduced lunch. At one household, I have a 45-year-old great-grandmother as a caregiver. 15, 15, 15 get you there every day. It's just, you can moralize about it all you want to. It's reality in life today. You decide to look after kids or you don't. Now, there are some grandmothers like yours and mine. Grandma, 87 years old, 14-year-old granddaughter out with the car cruising at 10 o'clock at night looking for a 31-year-old man. I didn't make that one up. After my wife died, I took care of my mother-in-law for 8 years. We have a 14-year-old niece. Now, in North Carolina, we don't allow 14-year-olds drive cars. And in no state do we allow a 14-year-old to be looking for a 31-year-old. Grandma can't get out of the rocking chair. 10:30 at night, I'm an hour and a half away. Somebody's got to go exact street justice in that matter. It had to be me. That's the responsibility, but understand that the living arrangements that you're trying to serve are changing dramatically, and you need to be mindful of who walks in the door. A couple of things that I want to wrap up with really, really quickly, and the one big thing that I want to do is this end to men and then triple whammy geographic individual. The good news first, because these are your challenges moving forward. The good news is that women are about to surpass men in the paid workforce as the numerical majority. In 2010, women constituted 49.8% of all paid workers. The operative term is paid. Women have been working all their lives. Ladies, this is not, the good news here is not because we've decided to treat you all fairly. There's still a huge gender wage gap out here. This reality is because men are doing so poorly in society today. Look at it. Today, 3 times as many men of working age do not work at all compared to 1969. Why don't they work? They don't have the skills to compete in a restructured economy. They're disabled or they're incarcerated. The disability rate has doubled. The median wage of the American male has declined, but the one I want to draw your attention to is after peaking in 1977, male college completion rates have barely changed over the last 35 years. The sex ratio in higher education has been 60% female, 40% male for a decade. We granted 572,000 more degrees to women in our higher education system than we did men in 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you at birth the sex ratio is not 60-40. It's more like what? 50-50. Where are the men? Where are the boys in society? See, you can't have stable families, you can't have stable communities, stable anything when you have that sex ratio imbalance. Because ladies, the good news is y'all educated, looking good, making money. If you ain't hitched up, the bad news is forget about it. It's not happening because there's not enough eligible, marriageable males to go around. That's what the End of Men thesis is about. If you read the book, you see and hear women talk about how hard it is to find someone. They don't want men that are not of a similar occupational and educational background, dragging them down and the like. And they tell you that. But this is a serious kind of problem in our society. We need to figure it out. The clue to it, I think, look at the data from our system, the UNC system. 43% male, the white schools 45% male, the minority and historically black schools are 36% male, the community college system is 44% male. We had one school a couple years ago that was 80-20, 80% female, 20% male. Where are the men? Where are the boys? It has a huge implication for family structuring, the things that we need to do, we need to be mindful of. Here's the clue to it. at the intersection of the browning and graying of America is something we call the triple whammy of geographic disadvantage. Let me develop it for you really quickly. Those counties right there are racial generation gap counties. And those counties, the adult voting age population are predominantly white, aging, empty nesters. But the school age population is predominantly non-white. What kind of support for public education do you think you get there? That's the ain't got no dog in the K-12 education fight. I'm most concerned about crime, safety, and retirement amenities, and they typically vote self-interest, okay? Those counties are majority minority counties. The adult voting age population is predominantly white. The school age population is predominantly non-white. School age population is predominantly non-white. Lots of interest in public education. They're all low wealth counties, not enough money to do anything there. The rest of the counties, the gray, are majority counties. The adult voting age population is predominantly white. The school age population is predominantly white. But in those districts, about a fifth of the kids who go to school in those districts are kids of color. If you peer beneath the veneer, though, what you will find is that the kids of color are typically attending either racially isolated schools in those districts or in the quote-unquote good schools. They are underrepresented in the learning, in the college prep tracks, honors, AP, IB, and the like. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, I just painted a picture where the new majority are basically people of color, kids of color. They're between a rock and a hard place through no fault of their own. And it gets worse. Those neighborhoods right there are predominantly white. 60% or more of the population is non-Hispanic white. 60% or more of the population there is non-white, and the yellow counties are transitioning from white to non-white. That's hyper-segregation, separate and unequal, rivaling the segregation in 1954, the year Brown versus Board of Education. School-age poverty, 40% or more of the kids coming to school from households with incomes below the poverty level, between 25 and 39% poverty. That's concentrated poverty. That's concentrated affluence right there. When I talk about the triple whammy, the average kid walking in a school door today comes from this kind of situation. And how many? 9.8 million kids got all three of those things. They tend to be 93% non-white. That's our challenges, ladies and gentlemen, the groups that we got to serve. And the key to where those boys are is in those numbers of concentrated poverty. If we're going to rise to the challenge of dealing with our changing demography, we got to deal with the triple whammy of geographic disadvantage. Thanks very much.